The heavy oak doors of the 1844 room at Windsor Castle closed, with a sound that was less a click and more a verdict. It was the first week of a bitter February, and the wind off the Thames seemed to rattle the very glass in the mullioned windows, as if the weather itself was trying to listen. Inside, the air was not cold, but it was dense, pressed down by the weight of wool suits, polished metals, and a silence that had been growing between the men in the room for nearly 8 years. King Charles III, seated at the head of a long mahogany table that had witnessed the planning of state funerals and the signing of treaties, looked smaller than his sons remembered. The cancer, which the palace had only described as a temporary challenge, had carved new lines into his face and stolen the robust energy he had displayed even at his coronation. He was not dying today, but the shadow of mortality sat beside him like an uninvited guest. The meeting had been called with unusual secrecy. No announcement was posted on the royal family's social media channels. No polite notice was given to the Press Association. The princes had been summoned individually. William drove from Adelaide Cottage in a state of simmering suspicion. Harry flew from Montecito alone, leaving Meghan and the children in California. The absence of the Duchess of Sussex was noted by the senior courtiers, who hovered near the coffee urns, but no one dared speak of it aloud. The agenda, as listed on the cream-colored card placed at each seat, read only, "Future of the Monarchy Private Discussion." It was a title so broad as to be terrifying. For the first hour, the conversation followed predictable tracks. They discussed the Commonwealth, the upcoming D-Day anniversary commemorations, and the King's desire to host a climate summit at Balmoral. William, the Prince of Wales, listened with his characteristic intensity, nodding but saying little, his blue eyes scanning his father's face for clues. Harry, sitting apart from his brother by 3 empty chairs, offered neutral observations about veteran charities, his voice careful, as if he were testifying in a deposition rather than talking to his family. It was polite. It was hollow. It was the architecture of a family that had learned to build walls around every vulnerable space. And then, the king cleared his throat. The sound was dry, a rattle that spoke of the chemotherapy he endured on Thursdays. He did not stand, as he usually did, to command attention. Instead, he leaned forward, placing his palms flat on the table. "I am not going to speak to the main point," he said, his voice reedy but precise. "Anne will." Every head in the room turned to the Princess Royal. Seated at her brother's right hand, Princess Anne wore her usual uniform of quiet utility, a simple green blouse, no jewelry except her wedding ring, her gray hair pinned back without fuss. She was the hardest working royal, the one who shook hands in the rain at muddy farm shows while others attended galas. She was also, perhaps uniquely, the only member of the family who had never sought the spotlight, and therefore the only one who could see it clearly. The king gave her a fractional nod. Anne did not smile. She simply placed her reading glasses on her nose and picked up a single sheet of paper. What she read aloud over the next 5 minutes would dismantle centuries of precedent. It was not a legal document, she explained, but a statement of intent from the sovereign. The king's final wish, should his health continue to decline, was not for a regency, nor for a quiet passing of the baton. It was for a complete, radical restructuring of the monarchy's operational code, effective immediately. The plan, which Anne detailed with the brisk efficiency of a naval officer reading orders, contained 3 shocks. First, the king wished to immediately downsize the list of councillors of state, removing non-working royals from the constitutional line of succession for governance. This would formally exclude Harry and his uncle, the Duke of York, from ever acting in the sovereign's place. Second, he wanted to legally separate the private wealth of the royal family from the sovereign grant, opening the duchies of Lancaster and Cornwall to full parliamentary audit. It was an act of financial transparency that would have made his mother blanch, but it was the third point that made William drop his pen. Charles wished to create a new legal instrument, the monarch's intent. Before his death, he would abdicate administrative duties to William, making his son Prince Regent in all but name, while Charles retained the title of king for ceremonial purposes only. The transfer of power would begin in 6 months, not 6 years. The timeline for William's ascension had just been crushed from a decade into a season. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of a held breath before a scream. William was the first to break it, but not with words. He pushed his chair back, the legs screeching against the parquet floor. He stood up, walked to the window, and stood with his back to the room. His shoulders were rigid. This was the moment he had prepared for his entire life, but preparation was theory, and this was a sledgehammer to reality. He had expected to have his father's counsel for another 10, perhaps 15 years. He had expected to watch, to learn, to ease into the role of sovereign as his grandmother had taught him. Now he was being told to pack his bags and move into the driver's seat of a vehicle that was still on fire. Harry, meanwhile, did not move. He sat frozen, not because of the abdication, but because of the silence around his own role. The document Anne read made no mention of a return for him. There was no olive branch, no whispered apology, no request for help. He was simply erased, the institutional equivalent of a draft excluder. He looked at his father, searching for the man who used to read him bedtime stories about St. George and the dragon. Instead, he saw a king calculating his legacy. The distance between the two chairs they occupied felt like the Atlantic Ocean. It was Princess Anne who broke the paralysis. She removed her glasses and folded the paper. "Before you react emotionally," she said, her voice a low gravel, "know that this was not a rushed decision. Charles has been drafting this for 18 months. He has consulted constitutional lawyers in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. This is not a wish born of panic, it is a strategy born of diagnosis." The revelation of the word diagnosis hung in the air. The public knew the king had cancer, but the family had been shielded from the grimmer particulars. Anne, who had accompanied her brother to his appointments, now revealed the truth. The specific form of cancer was aggressive. It had not spread to vital organs yet, but it was resistant to first-line treatments. The king was not dying tomorrow, but he was statistically unlikely to see the end of the decade. The abdication, or semi-abdication, was not a choice. It was a necessity. Charles wanted to see his son crowned or at least installed with his own eyes. He wanted to hand over the red boxes of state papers personally, not leave them as a posthumous instruction. William turned from the window. His face was pale, but his jaw was set. "You're asking me to take over while you're still alive," he said to his father. "To be a steward, not an heir. That changes the dynamic of every relationship I have, with the government, with the church, with him." He gestured vaguely in Harry's direction, a flick of the hand that was more dismissive than any insult. Harry flinched. "With me?" he said, his voice rising. "You're worried about your relationship with me? Father, you just announced a plan that removes me from the counselors list without even telling me beforehand. That's not a restructuring, that's a firing." "It's a recognition of reality," Anne interjected flatly. "You live in California. You write books about us. You cannot be trusted to hold the sovereign's power, even theoretically, when you sell interviews to CBS. That is not cruelty, Harry. That is common sense." It was the harshest thing anyone had said aloud in a royal meeting in years. Typically, such barbed truths were wrapped in the velvet of euphemism. But Anne had never learned to velvet wrap anything. She was the daughter of a naval officer and the mother of Olympians. She dealt in facts. The fact was that Harry's position had become untenable the moment he signed the Netflix deal. The Crown could not afford a half-in, half-out participant in the digital age. Charles's final wish was to force a clarity that the Sandringham Summit of 2020 had failed to achieve. The king finally spoke. His voice was softer than Anne's, but no less firm. "I love you both," he said, looking from William to Harry. "That has never been in question, but love is not the same as institutional fitness. I have spent 70 years waiting to do this job. I have spent 70 years watching the institution I love drift toward irrelevance because we refuse to modernize. I am not going to die with that weight on my conscience. William, you will be a fine king. But you will be a fine king only if you accept the crown without the clutter. And Harry, he paused, searching for words. Harry, you are my son, but you are not my co-worker. That distinction is the entire point of this document. Harry's eyes glistened, but he did not cry. He had learned in the crucible of therapy and tabloids that tears in this family were interpreted as manipulation. He simply nodded. Once, a short, sharp gesture of acknowledgement. So that's it then, he said. The final wish is that I become a footnote. The spare who got filed away. No, Anne said. The final wish is that you become a private citizen. You wanted freedom from the institution. This grants it. Completely. No more ambiguity. No more Royal Highness when it suits you and victim when it doesn't. You are out. The door is open. Walk through it, and live your life. The brutality of the phrasing was so pure, so devoid of the usual courtier's spin, that it actually landed as a form of honesty. William, who had been expecting a fight about precedence or titles, realized that the fight was already over. His father and aunt had not called this meeting to debate. They had called it to inform. The monarchy was not a democracy. It never had been. Over the next 2 hours, the conversation shifted from shock to logistics. Anne produced a binder, thick as a novel, detailing the transition. William would receive the red boxes starting in April. He would attend Privy Council meetings as an observer. The king would retain the right to be consulted, to encourage, and to warn. The classic Bajazet definition of a constitutional monarch, but the active governance would shift. Charles would retreat to Highgrove to garden and paint watercolors. He would make the occasional state visit if his health permitted, but the daily grind of the monarchy, the audiences, the paperwork, the endless signing would fall to his son. For Harry, the binder contained a separate section, a proposed financial settlement, a one-time payment from the Duchy of Cornwall to be held in trust for his children in exchange for a permanent, legally binding waiver of all future claims to the Crown's assets. It was a severance package. It was also a muzzle. To accept the money was to accept the silence. To refuse was to continue the war with no ammunition left. Harry looked at the number on the page. It was generous by any normal standard, 8 figures, but a pittance compared to the wealth he would have accessed as a senior working royal. More importantly, it came with a clause that prohibited him from ever writing about his family again. No memoirs, no interviews, no podcasts. The story would end here, in this room, with this piece of paper. You're buying my silence, he said. We're buying your future, Anne corrected. You can either be the man who took the money and walked away, or the man who spent the next 40 years suing the Metropolitan Police and tweeting about your childhood. One of those is a life. The other is a sentence. William, who had been quiet, finally turned to face his brother fully. It was the first time they had made eye contact in over 2 years. The last time, at the coronation, Harry had sat 3 rows behind him, and their eyes had slid past each other like oil on water. Now, there was nowhere to hide. I don't want this, William said, his voice thick. I never wanted this. I wanted a brother who stood next to me. But you chose. You chose her. You chose California. You chose the money and the cameras. And I chose duty. So here we are. Father's final wish is just acknowledging that we made different choices. It was the most honest thing William had ever said to Harry in adulthood. It was not cruel. It was not forgiving. It was simply the truth, laid bare like a wound that had finally stopped bleeding. Harry opened his mouth to retort, to mention the bullying, the leaks, the way the palace had briefed against Meghan, but the words died on his tongue. What was the point? Anne was right. The door was open. The only question was whether he would walk through it or continue to rattle the handle. In the end, the meeting concluded not with a handshake, but with a shared cup of tea. The ritual of Englishness provided a bridge over the chasm. The king, exhausted, was helped from the room by his page. Anne followed, pausing only to lay a hand on Harry's shoulder. It was a brief touch, but heavy with meaning. She was not apologizing. She was saying goodbye. William and Harry were left alone in the 1844 room. The fire had burned low. Outside, the wind had died, and a wet snow began to fall, muffling the world. For 10 minutes, they sat in silence. Not a hostile silence, but the silence of two men who had run out of things to fight about. Harry reached for his phone, then thought better of it. William stared at the portrait of Queen Victoria on the wall, her stern gaze judging them both. "You'll be good at it," Harry said finally, not looking at his brother. "The job. You've got the patience for it. I never did." William nodded. "You'll be a good father. That's your job now. Be better than we were." It was not a reconciliation. It was a ceasefire, and in the brutal arithmetic of royal life, that was the best that Charles's final wish could hope to achieve. The king had not asked for his sons to love each other again. He had asked for clarity. He had asked for the institution to be preserved. And in the quiet of that snowy February evening, with the weight of 1,000 years of history pressing down on the rafters, that wish was granted. The script was written, the parts were cast, and the curtain, for better or worse, was about to rise on a new act of the British monarchy, one where the spare was finally, irrevocably, free.